Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I'm Deborah Yashar, EcoFarm's Communications Director. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I'd like to make a couple announcements. First off, I'd like to invite everyone to participate in EcoFarm's new online community platform. So that way we can continue sharing knowledge and resources with each other year-round. If you've missed any of the workshops, you can feel free to watch them, watch the recordings. They'll soon be available in the archives folder. Also, really excited to share that starting in April, EcoFarm will be hosting experiential field days on farms throughout the Central Coast and in Northern California. Registration will be opening really soon for that, so stay tuned. We do want to be in person with you all. A big thank you to our conference sponsors, Full Belly Farm, Farmer and Cook, Driscoll's, CCOF, Heart and Soil Magazine, Veritable Vegetable, and Stepsky Foundation. Thank you. And now I'd like to introduce today's keynote speakers. Mark Arax has been called a 21st century John Steinbeck for his books that pry open the soul of California. No writer has devoted more pages to the story of California agriculture, small farmers and big farmers, conventional farmers and organic farmers, and the migrants who work the crops. A two-time winner of the California Book Award, he eloquently chronicles the culture of extraction that has leveled valleys and drained rivers and lakes. His newest book, The Dreamt Land, Chasing Water and Dust Across California, is being hailed by critics as one of the most important books ever written about the West, which has also become a national bestseller. Following Mark Arax, we will hear from Janaki Anagha. Janaki is the Director of Community Advocacy at Community Water Center and has worked in the San Joaquin Valley advancing just agricultural and environmental policies for communities that are bearing the burden of California's food system. She has worked to enforce worker protections and access to clean drinking water in unincorporated farmworker communities and has assisted in curriculum development for the Sustainable Agriculture and Food Systems undergraduate degree at UC Davis. Janaki has farmed in diversified and orchard crops across the state and holds a JD from UC Davis School of Law. She is also a co-founder of the California Farmer Justice Collaborative. So a big welcome to Mark and Janaki.
EcoFarms, it's good to be with you, although this is not the way I wanted it. I was telling my sons that I had three wishes, places to go that I want to see before I go. One is Armenia, where my family came from. One is Ireland, because I love Irish music and Irish literature. And the other is I wanted to go to EcoFarms. So I'm sitting here in Fresno looking out at my backyard. It's not there, but it's the best we have. So thank you for joining me. I kind of want to start off not as formal as I would have if we were in person, and just telling some stories. And so, I often get asked, what possesses me, what possessed me to write two, dare I say, kind of seminal books about California and agriculture. The stories of J.G. Boswell, the biggest cotton farmer in the world, the story of Stuart Resnick, the biggest farmer in America, and then the small guys, John Kirkpatrick, who grows citrons with Orthodox rabbis from the East Coast out in, along the east side of the San Joaquin Valley, and stories of the Pandals and how the Pandals farming was changed by Amigo Bob, and what's that all about? Where does that stem from? And I don't really know. It's kind of a mystery to myself, but I have a guess, and my guess is my grandfather. My grandfather was a survivor of the Armenian genocide. In fact, he hid in an attic in Istanbul. and in 1915, 1916, and he kind of outlasted the 3 years of the genocide, came down from that attic. He had gone up there with books of French literature, and his dream was to study French literature at the Sorbonne in Paris. And when he came down from that hiding spot, he went to work at an Armenian bookstore, one of the last surviving bookstores that an Armenian owned in Istanbul. And he met some people who were going to actually pay his way to the Sorbonne. This was around 1919. So as he was getting prepared for this journey, these letters came from Fresno, California, from his uncle, who was a survivor of the Armenian genocide, lost his entire family, his wife, his children, and didn't know where to go, and landed in the San Joaquin Valley and was writing these letters to my grandfather. You must come here. There's a new Armenia. And he started singing the virtues, the myths of California. He told my grandfather that the grapes hang here like massive jade eggs, and the watermelons are so large that when you scoop out the meat, you can actually ride down the rivers and the irrigation canals in what was left of the rind. So my grandfather had this choice in 1920. He was 18, 19 years old, and it was either Paris, France, or Fresno, California, and he chose the latter. And so he landed here and went right to work in the fields on his hands and knees, picking the crops in the valley. And back then it was possible with 3, 4 years of labor, especially after his mother and brother and sister joined him together as a workforce. They were able to stack enough coin to buy 20 acres, a vineyard on the west side of Fresno. And that's where my father was born. By the time I came along, 40 years later, the we had sold our last farm, and this was one along the San Joaquin River. And I grew up in suburbia. My only real exposure to farmland was my grandfather's backyard. He had this 25 by 25-foot plot that just yielded an extraordinary amount of vegetables and fruits. And he used only two things, sulfur, compost, and a little manure. And he just worked that ground with his hoe, and out came this miracle. I mean, I don't think this is the imagination of a young boy, but I remember one year among the tomatoes, the eggplants, the Armenian peppers, the guta, which is an Armenian cucumber, the melons and everything else, he planted okra. And this okra grew, first it grew taller than me, then it grew taller than him, then it grew taller than everyone in our family, past the roof up into the sky. It really was like watching, a real live Jack and the Beanstalk. And so, he had great pride in this. And then he would take me to the homes of this kind of army of Armenian backyard farmers in Fresno who couldn't quite make it on the real farm, maybe couldn't afford it. Maybe, um, the Depression years took their farms, but they were doing something in their backyard that was remarkable. And I remember my grandfather, they were very competitive about the size of their tomatoes and peppers and everything else. And I remember my grandfather taking me to a man who was kind of legendary among backyard farmers. His name was Donabed. And I remember walking into Donabed's house, and he pulled my ear. I mean, he pulled it hard. And then he took a 50-cent piece and handed it to me as a kind of gift for enduring the pulling. And then we went into his backyard, and I couldn't believe it. It was twice the garden of my grandfather's. Back in the day, my grandfather and grandmother were getting magazines published by Rodell, Prevention Magazine, and Organic Farming and Gardening. I remember in the early 60s seeing these magazines. And my grandfather was very committed to that way of growing stuff. Donabed, I assume, was committed in the same way. But I couldn't believe how prolific his garden was. So we got the tour of his garden. We went back in, had a glass of tea, and then we left. And then my grandfather sat next. I sat next to him in the car, and he was just shaking his head, and he said, "That damn Donabed, he's a cheater." And I said, "What do you mean he's a cheater?" And he said, "Miracle Grow." And I said, "What's Miracle Grow?" And he goes, "Miracle Grow." So apparently Donabed was taking shortcuts to get his garden. And this was my introduction to farming. And then fast forward years later, and I'm a journalist with the Los Angeles Times, and I happen to have come back home to cover the middle of California, almost as a foreign correspondent. And a flood hits in 1996. And I get a call from a colleague in our Sacramento bureau, and he said, "Mark, Tulare Lake has come back to life." And I said, "Tulare Lake? What's Tulare Lake?" And he said, "Well, pull out your map." So I pulled out the map, and he said, "Trace Highway 43 out past Hanford to the town of Corcoran." And I did that. And there was on the map this lake. And it was painted blue, as lakes should be painted. But the damnedest thing, it was in the shape of a perfect square almost. The square lake. And so a couple of days later, I got in the car and I drove out that highway and I passed Hanford. And as I came up to Corcoran, I went along a road, and at the end of the road, it kind of ended. It just stopped. And there before me was this huge levee, this big dike, something that you might see in the Mississippi Delta, the Florida Everglades, or Holland. And I stopped the car, parked it, and started walking up this levee. And as I got to the top, the air had changed. The smell of the air had changed. And I looked out, and what was cotton fields had become this inland sea. I mean, the wind was whipping white caps past these telephone poles, and the speed with which nature had found itself. I mean, this is just 5, 6 days into a flood, was astounding. I mean, birds were stabbing at fish, and it looked like the New Jersey Shore or something like that. If you look close at the telephone poles, you could see these marks. And I didn't know it at the time, but I later learned that these marks were the high water marks of previous floods. And so the story of Tulare Lake was that man had drained this lake dry, first by the diversions of ditches and canals, and then later by dams and siphons and huge pumps that actually made the 4 rivers that fed into the lake run backward. The Kings River, one of the mighty rivers of California, the powerful pumps of the Boswell Cotton Company could actually stop that flow and make it run backward. So as I was driving back to Fresno, I thought, what is the story of this lake? What is the history of this lake? Why did I grow up dumb to this lake? You know, there were irrigation canals that latticed Fresno when I was growing up. I mean, one went by my grandfather and grandmother's house. It was just three doors down. My grandmother said, "Never go near that ditch. If you go near that ditch, you will lose your balance, fall in, and no one will fish you out." And that was actually true because every summer, the children of the Mexican migrants in the 105, 110-degree heat would swim in those irrigation canals, and sometimes they would drown. And I never thought Never wondered why these canals were completely unfenced and accessible, or what they were doing there in the first place. Where was that water coming from? Where was it going to? Who was getting the spoils of that water, and by what right? These were questions I never asked myself as a kid. But as I went out to Tulare Lake and came back, I started thinking about the valley in a different way. And so I decided to delve into the history of Tulare Lake and to write a book about it. And about a year into the book, when I knew that it was going to be an epic story, I had a friend named Rick Wartzman who was working for the Wall Street Journal. He said how that he was visiting me in Fresno, and he asked how that book is going. And I said, it's going to be slow. It's going to be a 10-year project. And he said, do you need some help? He was covering back then the Clinton administration, and he was in Washington. And part of this story of the draining of this lake took place in Washington when the decision was made to dam the lake. The Army Corps dammed the lake. And the justification was that the lake was a flood zone. So that began this journey backward. Rick joined me. We ended up finishing the book in 5 years. And my job was to really delve into the valley, to tell the story of that lake. And that lake begins in indigenous times. Um, there were 4 distinct tribes of Yoka Indians who lived along its shores in the tules, the bulrushes. They made their rafts out of tules. They would fish with a hole in a spear, a hole in the raft with a spear. The women would wade into the lake. It was a shallow lake. Remember, this is 4 rivers: the Kings, the Kaweah, the Tule, and the Kern River. In flood years, they drain into that, that depression in the earth. They do not go out to the ocean. And so the lake is shallow, and it ebbs and flows given California's inherent weather from flood to drought. And it was so shallow, the women would wade in and fish clams, mussels with their toes. This was 10,000 years of history that was erased first by the Spanish missions, then by that 25-year seizure of California, takeover of California by Mexico, and then finally that taking that happened in 1846 by the United States, the settlers coming. So when you trace the history of Tulare Lake, you really trace the history of California, the capture of water, the defiance of nature, and the rising of agriculture. And so that book told that story of the Southern Confederates who came here in the wake of the Civil War and started diverting from those 4 rivers. And then in 1920, the Boswells and the Salyers and other people from the South who were chased out of the South by the boll weevil. These were slave owning families, plantation owners. They ended up coming west to Tulare Lake and then buying that flood water and draining the rest of it by buying up rights in the canal companies and siphoning the water out of the rivers, out of the lake, and then eventually building a dam. This is the story of how the plantation South came to the middle of California. It explained to me why, growing up, this place felt like the South. Politics, the people, the racism, the, um, the racism that was built right into our real estate codes. And it just didn't affect Negroes or Mongolians, as they called them, or Mexicans. Along with those 3 were restrictive real estate covenants that wouldn't let Armenians live in certain parts of Fresno. So my people were colorized, racialized. They called us Black Turks, which is probably one of the worst things you can call the Armenians who had just survived a genocide at the hands of the Turks. And so that was, that explained that kind of question, that mystery of me growing up in Fresno a little bit, why we lived in a certain part of town. Uh, and let's take a little break and let's cut into that for a second. Let me go and take a look at my notes and we'll pick that up a little bit. So The King of California is a book that helped me explain um, California before we arrived and then before I was born. And then the whole cotton culture and the plantation culture coming west. I thought that once I'd written that book, I was going to go back to my other books, and I didn't want to write about water or agriculture again. And I did. My other books weren't about water or agriculture. But then the drought came, the, the, the worst drought in recorded California history. And a lot of the journalists who were kind of parachuting in from the East Coast and other places just didn't seem to be getting the history right. And so I thought, okay, it's time to tell this story from a drought perspective. And so I decided in 2013, 14 to write the Dreamt Land. And that was a 5-year journey that extended beyond where I'd kind of dug in before. My first book was about my father's unsolved murder, basically the story of our journey out of genocide and the story of Fresno and its corruptions and everything else. The next book was The King of California, so I went about 50 miles south and kind of extended beyond my own backyard. And then did a third book called West of the West, a bunch of essays about California. So the Dreamt Land was going to be a journey following water throughout the state. But I was going to focus again on what I call the most intensive agricultural experiment in the history of man. And that is the agriculture that we did in the San Joaquin Valley. And how drought kind of shined a certain light on it and what was going on in drought. So put my boots on, started driving down Highway 99 and finding farmers and others to talk to. And something very odd was going on. Here we were in the midst of this record drought. In fact, let's fast forward. This past decade has been the driest decade in recorded history. We basically had 8 to 9 years of drought interrupted by a flood. Maybe 1 year average in between. So you would expect in that time of water scarcity that the footprint of agriculture would probably be reduced. At the worst, it would stay the same, but it should get reduced because the water was so dramatically reduced, the snow melt. Instead, something quite surprising was happening. In that driest period in California's recorded history, the farmers of the San Joaquin Valley added 660,000 more acres of permanent crops, almonds principally, pistachios, and mandarins. And as this drought was happening, they were pulling off record crops. And so basically, it was with that mystery in mind that I went into the orchards and vineyards and fields of the middle of California to figure out what was going on. And you know the story by now. There was some water that was being taken from one area that had better groundwater, and it was shipped via pipes to an area that was dry Those pipes might have extended 2 to 3 counties. Um, the farmers were going deep into the earth. I mean, the Boswell Company was building wells that were going 2,500 feet into the ground. So much so that the levees that I was standing on, a decade earlier, were sinking. The aqueduct itself, that 444-mile concrete river that we'd built to move the rain from where it fell to where it didn't, that was sinking too because so much water was being extracted out of the ground that the clay was collapsing on itself and drawing the earth downward. It was almost as if, imagine termites eating at the structure of your house. It's not something that kind of ravage is not something you hear. It's not even something you see. It's almost imperceptible. It's so small and then gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So this is what was happening. We were extracting at a level that we had never extracted before. So that question took me backward, as it always does, because history answers those questions. So where did the ethos of extraction begin? Well, my editor thought that, and he's an East Coast person, he thought logically that it's the gold rush. But no, actually, the first taking of California was the taking of the body of the indigenous. It was that taking that allowed the Spanish missions to tap into the first flows of river, to build the first canals and ditches and the first crude dams. And this gave rise to a profusion of the first vineyards and orchards in California. That experiment was all because they had captured the body of the Indian, which allowed them to turn that into a workforce, which then captured the flow of the rivers. We have a California conceived in genocide. Then you move to the gold rush and you see that same ethos playing out. This time you're capturing water, its force to now unearth riches, gold. And that whole extraction was basically to the benefit of a handful of industrialists who came here from afar. California gets shot out of a canyon. We don't need manifest destiny to really make California. We have the gold rush, and it does it almost overnight. 80,000 people arrive, and they're from all over the world. It's probably the most diverse origins of any state in America. So that experiment goes on for 20, 25 years. And then what happens is it culminates in the destruction of mountainsides that are washed down. All that debris is washed down the rivers, and the silt and the mud then cover the early experiments of agriculture. Those experiments obviously are in the alluvial plains where the richest soil is. So in the 1880s, California has a choice. Do we continue mining gold, or do we mine the soil? And the California Supreme Court ruled that one industry could not destroy another industry, and basically the gold mines were, for all intents and purposes, shut down. And this gave rise in the 1880s to agriculture on an epic scale. It began with the wheat farms, the wheat growers. In fact, the wheat king back then was a man named Isaac Friedlander, a giant of a man, 6'7", more than 300 pounds. They said his stride was the stride of 2 men, if not 3. And he had made his money selling flour to the gold mines. And now he decided that he was going to basically corner the market on wheat, growing it, harvesting it, and sending it to Europe via clipper ships. And so began these millions of acres in the middle of California turned into wheat, a monoculture. And as all of you well know, a monoculture has an Achilles heel, and that is what it robs from the soil. And wheat robbed so much that as fast as that whole thing rose, it kind of withered. The yields came way, way down. And Friedlander, Chapman, and some of these other industrialists decided that it was time now to break up their vast holdings of land and sell it to smaller farmers. And so from the 1890s to the 1930s, we have a lot of small farmers coming here. This is when my grandfather arrives, 1920. And we see this rise of a diversified kind of agriculture that at a scale that the world's never seen. My grandfather arrived in a very important year. In 1920 was the year that the turbine pump was put out into the agricultural fields. And this allowed farming now to move from the alluvial plain, the reach of canals and ditches, to somewhere beyond that. And the ground was not as primo as the alluvial ground. So we see a huge expansion in the 20s, 30s, 40s of agriculture, the footprint going out from primo ground to marginal ground. And the pump then, the aquifer gets lowered so much that the pump can't reach it. It's too expensive. The costs are too high. Farms start to wither, and a cry comes up from the valley in the 1930s. Basically, we have to steal ourselves a river. To grow agriculture more, we need to import water. Now, this would have sounded like a very fanciful idea, except that, a decade and a half before, the city of Los Angeles had done just that. They had run out of their puny river, the Los Angeles River. They went up and over the mountain 230 miles to Owens, and they stole themselves a river. And so the farmers of the San Joaquin Valley decided that they would lobby their politicians, Sacramento, to try to do the same. And this is what gives rise to the Central Valley Project, that drought of the 1920s and 30s. So agriculture takes the floodwaters from the Sacramento River and brings it north to south. And then the farmers of Kern County and Tulare, they take the flow of the San Joaquin River, which runs through Madera and Fresno. They dam that and send that water to a place it never went, 130 miles south to Tulare and eventually Bakersfield. So we see this incredible, kind of shifting of water. 20 years later, more floods come, and this gives rise to the State Water Project, which ends up taking more flows out of the north in the Delta and moving those flows to the west side of Kern County, where farmers want to grow more, and then up and over the mountain to the faucets and swimming pools of Los Angeles. And these two systems, the CVP and the SWP, become what I call the system, the grandest, water moving experiment in the history of man. So what we see is those two projects didn't merely satisfy the farmers who were growing then. They actually whet the appetite of farmers to come, farmers to expand even more. And so the footprint of agriculture starts creeping outward ever more. And then comes not the turbine pump, but something along those lines. It's drip irrigation. And drip irrigation is sold as a water saving, device. In actuality, it's a yield enhancing device, as you well know. And in the aggregate, there is kind of a paradox to drip irrigation. In the aggregate, it actually we use more water because drip now allows farmers to grow crops on ground that should never be farmed. I mean, there are, if you came here, I could drive you tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of acres that shouldn't be farmed, but are because of the miracle of drip. That little line delivering a precise dose of water and chemical so that the tree you're growing could almost be growing hydroponically. Really, the dirt is there just to hold it up. And then we see uphill expansion of orchards. Furrow irrigation could never go uphill. So now we have a situation where the system we built, which was a miracle system, it's defiance of gravity, what it brought to California. We now come up against a limit line. When the system was conceived, there were 10, 13 million Californians. There are 40 million now. On top of that limit line and the inherent swings that we have from drought to flood, which make that system, which give that system problems. Okay, that system is not able to deliver the water that it should because of extended droughts. Now we have climate change hitching on to drought, and we are seeing a kind of havoc we've never seen before. More extended droughts, hotter summers, Januaries that feel like Marches, the lack of chilling hours, that trees need to go into a deep hibernation, the use of chemicals to put them into hibernation. I'm thinking of the cherry trees, the cherry orchards of Kern County. This is what we're seeing now. And so the book, as we're going through and exploring all these farmers and what they've done, their families before them, and what they're doing to try to transform the ground and respond to these changes, a question is rising up as well. And that question is, how much longer can we go on like this? I like to say there's an awareness that we need to change. And we're seeing that. I mean, the state of California, we think of our state as a progressive place, but it was one of the last states to regulate groundwater. And when they did, through SGMA, Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, they put such a lead time in it, 25 years, that basically what it did is it just gave the farmers who wanted to grow more and the new farmers, and when I say new farmers, I'm talking about hedge funds, the Canadian Royal Mounties pension funds, retirement funds, the Mormon church, it gave them an incentive now to dig more wells, go deeper into the ground before SGMA takes effect. And so now we see a kind of nth degree of extraction that is destroying these aquifers. And I saw what happened this summer in Madera. I wrote a piece for the Atlantic Monthly about a well fixer who wanted to warn all his community that the aquifer was collapsing. Okay, so we're going into another summer of the same thing. We're going to see what that brings. I like to think the book, and I hope this talk maybe ends on a positive note, and that is that kind of goes back to my grandfather and Rodell's organic farming and gardening. It's never more important. It's never been more important for us to embrace the ideals, the precepts of the kind of farming you folks do. You're our way out of this. Yes, I know organic farming has changed. It's not, it's not those folks, the early ones who came out of UC Santa Cruz, and the hippies who went into their 5 and 10 acres and 20 acres and 30 acres. Yes, industrial agriculture has discovered organic farming. I think the organic farmer of the year this year or last year had something like 25, 30,000 acres. But let's put that aside. The soil, what you're doing to the soil, okay? And I've gone and visited with my friend Tom Willey, some of the innovators of California organic farming, okay? Phil Foster being one of them. I see what's going on. I think there's something to the capture of carbon. Those men who are trying to do it will admit to you that it may be hype. They don't know the reality, but there's something there. But all the things you are doing are the things we need to go back to. Okay. Maybe not the combination of sulfur and cow manure that my grandfather was using back there, but the sophistication of what you're doing, the science of what you're doing is a way for us to reduce the footprint of agriculture. I mean, we're going to have to, in the San Joaquin Valley alone, and the farmers will concede this, and the irrigation district managers will concede this. We are farming 6 million acres, basically. We're going to have to go down to 4.5 million acres to achieve something that's sustainable, where the groundwater is being recharged as much as it's being extracted. To do that, because listen, the last thing we want to see is the San Joaquin Valley or the Central Valley turn into another, San Fernando Valley, just filled with endless suburbs. This ground, these rivers, the sun, this was meant for agriculture, but we've got to find our way back to a better agriculture. And that's where you all come in, leading the way. And in a sense, in a perverse way, I think climate change has opened up an opportunity. We don't have the wiggle room we used to. We're up against the line, and some force is coming from the other side. And I think it will allow us to make arguments that have a kind of force that they didn't have before. Let me give you a quick example, and then I'll end this. I'm moving now beyond the farm to suburbia, because that sprawl model of farming became the sprawl model of our suburban growth. About 4 months after the Paradise Fire, the deadliest fire in California history, I drove up there. I'd never been to Paradise. And now, as I was taking the road from Chico, that beautiful farmland outside Chico, which, by the way, has been preserved by a green line that did not allow that city to grow into those orchards. One of the first urban growth boundaries to protect agriculture, if not the first in California. So as I'm driving from Chico up this skyway, and it's literally a road that is taking you into the sky, and you're driving up to Paradise, and you see on one side of you a river canyon, and on the other side of you a river canyon. And it occurs to you that you are driving up the ledge of a geological chimney. And then you arrive there and you see all the destruction. And it occurs to you that a county planted 40,000 people in the direct path of wildfire. And that the state allowed this to happen. And that today, 10 million of the 40 million Californians live in the path of wildfire, in the wildland urban interface. And how even as we're having these record wildfires and the smoke is pouring down, and literally it sits in my valley for 3 months. I've got HEPA filters blowing all the time here. Hardly make it outside in those months. As all that's happening, we are continuing to build more houses in suburbia, spending more money, expanding freeways, widening them, making new ones into the woodlands of California. This is all wrong. And we can't quite embrace the other way yet, but we're getting there. Will we get there fast enough? So I don't know if that's a hopeful note, but that's how I'd like to end it, that in the midst of all of this, I think it allows us to get creative and to do things that maybe were folks didn't have the guts to do before. They didn't have the spine to do before. Politicians wouldn't dare utter these things, but now we might. So anyhow, I'm looking forward to going out, visiting some of you on some of the great organic farms of California, seeing what you're doing and writing about it. It wasn't perfect. It's hard talking into a camera. It wasn't as seamless as I hoped, but I cherish this opportunity to have talked to you today. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you all at Eco Farm this year. It's a fabulous event, and I'm really lucky to be able to talk to you on the subject of agricultural justice, focus in the San Joaquin Valley, and knitting together some of the themes you've already heard about from my colleague, Mark Arax, and other folks who have been identifying some of these disparities that are faced by rural communities that live and work in our most agriculturally productive region of the state. My name is Janaki Anagha, and I am the Director of Community Advocacy at Community Water Center. We are a nonprofit organization with offices in the most impacted regions of California, in Visalia, Watsonville, and our policy office in Sacramento. And we focus on achieving safe and affordable drinking water for all Californians. So a little bit about myself. That's me all the way on the right. When I was an adolescent, I had the opportunity to spend a chunk of my youth working for a Japanese American owned farm down in Southern California. Folks who are attending the conference may be familiar, since it's such a celebrated small farm. It's called Chino Farm in North County, San Diego, growing diversified fruits and vegetables. And I got a lot of my political education and understanding about agriculture and the realities faced by agricultural communities from these guys, the folks who work there, who pick the fruits and vegetables for the farm, and who come from Oaxaca, from the northern region of the state of Oaxaca, and who are indigenous people. Over a third of our farm worker force in California are indigenous folks from the state of Oaxaca, who speak indigenous languages, sometimes Spanish and English, but oftentimes monolingually speaking their native tongue. So for me, my step into political activism, as I said, really came from understanding the lived experience of folks who work in the field, regardless of how beautiful, diverse, and rosy some forms of agriculture can be. There are still environmental outcomes from agriculture that have to be understood across the system. And environmental justice, we're lucky to have a common definition of this that has been fought for and won by generations of environmental justice advocates who have created this definition, initially created by a executive order under the Clinton administration. And this is our California EPA definition: the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, as it deals with environmental laws, regulations, and policies. And this, of course, is a goal that we're reaching for. We're nowhere close to having that participation or equal involvement of everybody. But that's at the core of the work that I do at Community Water Center, erasing those barriers between the communities that work on picking our fruits and vegetables and who has the ability to determine the safety and quality of their water source. I mainly focus my efforts, and our organization, Community Water Center, mainly focuses its efforts in these communities that we call disadvantaged unincorporated communities. And this definition here, which you can read, it is a sort of general definition. It's saying an annual median household income that is less than 80% of the statewide annual household income, that they're underinvested. It's kind of a nothing definition. And that's oftentimes because these are nothing places under state and federal law. These communities are our legacy, oftentimes farm worker communities, or just legacy rural communities that have been historically left out of decision-making process, not because of coincidence, maybe sometimes out of ignorance, but if it is out of ignorance, it is a structural ignorance, and oftentimes a structural racism that has allowed certain areas to be neglected from state and local planning, from having access to basic services. And oftentimes these places are on low value land, places that are very susceptible to flooding and fire. And they're also people who oftentimes populated by folks who don't have language access. These places are critically tied to the economic development of California. For those people who have read The Grapes of Wrath, these are those towns for whom not a lot has changed since the writing of that book, and since that era of kind of anarchic California development, at which point a lot of these homes that are in these communities were built. The shallow wells that are utilized as a drinking water source in these towns continue to be struggling with the same challenges of contamination, and a lot of the host of these other concerns, such as personal health and disease transmission, the vulnerability of the actual physical infrastructure and the housing. These are issues that maybe folks are more familiar with hearing about in other parts of the world, right? That these are not necessarily issues that a person thinks about as afflicting one of the wealthiest economies in the United States. And unfortunately, these are structural concerns that are still faced by hundreds of thousands of community residents across the state. So again, as I talked about, the lack of access to water and sewer services, housing, these issues of personal health, and the issue that these are primarily farm worker communities. And lastly, but very importantly, a lack of governance, and as we get more into this discussion today about the intersection of who holds power within agriculture and who holds access to decision-making, this is the critical linkage between the places that farm workers live and work, and the power holding of our food system. Why is it that our food system continues to have these disproportionate impacts on low-income communities of color? So since I work on water, I'll focus on water, but folks who are listening to this hopefully can take the understandings about the impacts to these communities and apply them to air, to pesticides, to soil quality, to all kinds of areas of environmental media. But for me, water, of course, is this critical and very stark linkage between power holding and essentially, the future of our rural communities. We have an over $50 billion agricultural economy based in the Central Valley, and the majority of that $50 billion being in the Central Valley, not all of it, but the vast majority. And what drives that is an ongoing usage of a huge amount of inputs, despite California having this huge organic agricultural economy. We also continue to use a lot of intensive fertilizers and pesticides. And maybe some of you know that California's biggest commodity is actually dairy. California is the leading dairy state, and these uses of our land, these agricultural practices, have severely impacted our aquifers. I'm sure that comes as no surprise as for those people who have a focus on ecological agriculture. But over 50% of the valley uses this shallow aquifer as their primary drinking water source. 95% of residential water is groundwater, and these sources contain a host of offenders here: nitrate, arsenic, heavy metals, bacteria. Dibromachloropropane is a pesticide byproduct. Uranium and trihalomethanes are just a couple of others. So as we talk about power and decision-making over our water sources, it would be remiss not to mention the special interests that, of course, have a hand in determining who receives water, where, when, why, and how. And to name these marketing orders, trade associations, and cooperatives is not to villainize anybody at all. It's merely to show that we have a specific set of interests that have been created in the name and in the mold of agriculture. But when it comes to supporting those people who are literally living in the cracks and crevices of these agricultural land parcels where all of these incredible commodities are being produced, we don't have a special interest recognizing or bringing those interests to the table. Community Water Center acts as that voice in many ways, and our partner organizations act as that voice in working alongside community residents to actually bring them to the Capitol to actually be able to have their voices reflected, translated, and ultimately at the drafting table for some of our critical legislation related to water. However, some of the folks that you see on the screen here have had those interests represented for a very, very long time. And of course, we have to remember that California's irrigation system is a product of this artificial arteryway across California that has been subsidized by the federal and state government. And when it comes to groundwater sources, which are not surface water, the communities that I work with are primarily, sometimes are, but very in a limited capacity are people who rely on on the irrigation water. I'm mainly working with people who are getting water directly from the ground through a shallow well. But we have this incredibly robust irrigation system that has been created by government in partnership with agriculture, transporting water where it's needed for the purpose of agricultural production. Folks would definitely benefit from checking out some of these maps, though I'm not going to go into these right now. These show some of the disparities faced by low-income communities in the Valley. So again, this triangle is kind of my bread and butter as somebody that works with the communities who are at the bottom of this pyramid, not in the county farm bureaus, trade associations, and marketing orders, but who are at the foundation of this pyramid, the people upon whom the food system relies. The people who pick and process our produce, the folks that are irrigators, who get up at before the crack of dawn to carry out the pipes that go and flood irrigate our agricultural fields, pesticide applicators and mixers, people who are transporting farm workers to and from work, and the farm workers themselves. And this Valley Ag political pyramid doesn't encompass those people for the most part. And why is that, right? I mean, scholars have been asking this question, and civil society has been asking this question. Why do some of these communities continue to deal with like these really bizarre and disturbing levels of disparity? That we have a human development index in the San Joaquin Valley that's, worse than anywhere else in the United States. And just a few potential answers are that our soils in the Valley continue to look like this, most definitely. There's slow or no adoption of sustainable practices by agriculture. all of our, the coastal communities, great energy towards soil carbon sequestration and soil improvement, protecting our soil microbiota. You know, I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't exist in the valley, but it is a really uphill battle working with private landowners to improve their consciousness around their agricultural land management activities. And that goes hand in hand with political conservatism. A lot of our elected officials still don't really believe in climate change, if you can believe it. Political disenfranchisement of communities I've gone into quite a bit. And another big thing that's really tied into this issue of who owns land and who makes the decisions about it is that elected officials for these rural communities don't come from or live in those rural areas. They are often living in the city, and maybe they are connected to agribusiness, but they don't have the lived experience of their constituents, where they turn on the tap and their water is contaminated with nitrates. They step outside and they're breathing air that's contaminated with pesticides and particulate matter. So it's tough to get that connection there until you have people who actually not only own their land, but live there and then have that lived experience, that connection to the land that our farm workers have every single day, spending several hours in the field, being embraced by the land, putting their sweat into the land. That's not a lived experience that many electeds have in the region. So I'll dive into a little story, just painting the picture of one of these communities. And this is me in this little black Prius over here, looking like a real liberal, just barreling down the street in Fresno, Western Fresno County. And this is around the time I was actually taking Mark Arax, who you heard from before, out into this community for some of the interviews that he did for the Dreamt Land. And you can see the mud on my tires here. And I had just barely gone off of the road. And because of the silty, the fact that the soil is so poor in this region, there had just been a rain and the soil just turns into this slick clay that just slicks onto your tires, and it's impossible to get out of here. And ironically, this young guy who was drilling a 3,000-foot ag well, for those of you who don't know about well depths, that's the average, about the average for an ag well in this region, which is phenomenally deep. This is a phenomenally deep well. And he pulled me out of here, luckily. And I was on my way to this community that, you know, I was just visiting again a couple of days ago. Here you see the name El Progreso, but it's also known as El Porvenir or Three Rocks, Tres Piedras. You'll hear a lot of different names for this small community. And that's just to give you an idea, you know, of like when a community is unincorporated, there was never a moment when a city council was formed and said, we're going to call this place Asilomar, or we're going to call this place Santa Cruz, or we're going to call this place Sacramento. To the contrary, there's a collection of people living here who have been serving the local agricultural industry for decades upon decades, and a lack of collective understanding of who necessarily, you know, who governs the place. And if you ask two different people who live in the same place, they may have a completely different name for it. This is just a little bit more of what the landscape there looks like. The only things here are really a little mechanic shop, Three Rocks service. And there's a dry park in the middle that tends not to get any water, especially during drought years. And across the street is the almond orchards that are receiving this incredible amount of water through a large infrastructure. There is a tiny liquor store that also sells tortas. And the community lives in these kind of homes. These are kind of trailers, mobile homes, and the population of this area goes from like maybe 700 people to 900, 1,100 people during harvest season, since it's a community where migrant farm workers will come in and rent a trailer or rent a room. And this is the way that, that migrant farm workers have access to housing, especially in an area like this that is about 40 minutes or an hour away from medical services, from any emergency response, from a grocery store, like a full service grocery store. They need a place to live. And this community pays about $200 a month for water that they can't drink. They rely on this bottled drinking water service that you see here, which is paid for by the state water board, who provides this delivery to community residents on a monthly basis. This is because this community is in an extremely vulnerable water system. They receive water from the Irrigation Canal, which is serviced by Westlands Water District. That water is contaminated. It goes to a treatment facility that this community cannot really pay for the operation and maintenance of, and they can't pay for the level of treatment necessary to make that water drinkable, or at least not, at least make it compliant with state law. And in order to get to drinking water that's below the ground, well, as I said before, you're going to have to drill down 3,000, maybe more feet, and hope that you're going to get water that doesn't have manganese, selenium, uranium, nitrates. And although, partner organizations of ours are working to get the ball rolling, to get those wells drilled and see where there's a capacity to get to clean drinking water, well, for right now, that solution hasn't been reached yet. We've still got, these communities dealing with this critical problem where there's just no access to drinking water, whether you drill or whether you get it from surface water sources. This is the little market that services the community. So of course, I have to just bring us back to this question of why these communities exist. It's not a coincidence. We didn't just wake up in 2022 and these communities are dealing with these contamination crises, and our government agencies are all working together to get to a solution. That's just not what it is. This is decades in the making, centuries in the making of a colonial legacy of California that's resulted in us to have, as some people say, these tiny Fergusons across California that are dealing with this lack of access to this basic human need of water. And as we look at this history, of course, there's been a legacy of scholarship trying to identify the reason. But I think we're at a point in history now where we can realize there isn't just one answer to that question. There is a long answer to that question, and that answer lies in structural racism and a removal of human beings from their ecology. And these are just a couple of texts to refer folks to around unpacking these issues. And I'm lucky to say I was able to co-author one of the chapters in the struggle with Dr. O'Connell and Dr. Peters. And these are fantastic, pieces of work to look to kind of understand these answers for yourself. I also wanted to, of course, uplift Dr. Isao Fujimoto, who for me was a huge inspiration in just trying to understand these connections a little bit deeper, and the importance of multicultural organizing to heal some of these issues. So I'll just end with a few of our solutions that Community Water Center has been advancing along with community residents. We work to pass a safe and affordable drinking water fund, $1.4 billion over the next 10 years to address some of these very intractable drinking water issues to be able to finance the build out of treatment facilities and consolidating some of these tiny towns that don't have the pipelines to connect to big cities, and dealing with the legal issues that exist where there's a big city that just doesn't want to provide basic services to a small town. You know, those small towns need advocates to be able to be at the table and help create those physical infrastructure connections and the political infrastructure connections needed to govern those water resources in a safe and compliant way. We've also worked to advance some of these maximum contaminant levels, which maximum contaminant level just means that's the level at which, if the public water system were to test and then find that contaminant at the maximum contaminant level, that could then trigger some action, legal action or administrative action to get that system to clean up its water. And this is how we get there. Community organizing. This is where the picture is taken in Delray, California, an unincorporated town outside of Fresno that deals with the legacy contaminant 1,2,3-trichloropropane. And we're here talking to community residents. Hey, like, this is how advocacy works. These are other community residents who have gone to Sacramento and had their voices heard. And you'll see here Poplar, California, and Cutler, California, communities that have been represented in these hearings. And the last thing I'll show you is just that, here's an image from 1966, the Farmworker March that took place, the union organizing movement. And you'll see some of the very same towns named here, Cutler and Lindsay, Porterville, Ducor. These are the communities that we at Community Water Center still work with on a daily basis. Some of the advocates that champion our bills and are at the table meeting on a monthly basis to advance their needs are people who actually marched in this very march and who are connected deeply to the farm worker organizing movement. And it's an honor to get to work with them and learn from them and advance their interests every day. So thank you very much for listening in, and I look forward to engaging any questions that folks may have, and hope that we can be in touch and my information will be shared so that you can get in touch. Thank you.
Oh, I want to thank you, Janaki and Mark, again for all your time, for your dedicating your work and yourselves to these critical issues of our time. We're really glad to be shedding light on the people, the water, and the land of California's Central Valley, to which we're inextricably linked, but which hasn't always been well represented at EcoFarm Conference. We really appreciate your contributions to advancing a more just and ecological future for farm workers, for our children, and for our children's children. Thank you. So next up at 10:30 a.m., everyone, is an opportunity to chat directly with David Mancera to get your farm business and financial questions answered. And then workshops will begin at 11:15 a.m. So with that, I want to thank you all again for being with us today on day 2 of the 42nd Annual EcoFarm Conference. Thanks, everyone.